Okay, so today I just want to run you through making this tiny little gauge swatch for Adventures in Overlay Mosaic. Um, the gauge swatch is actually also exactly the same pattern that I've used for pattern 1, so the tutorial will work for both. I do always encourage you to actually make the gauge swatch though, just so you can make sure that you're happy with the way your stitches look and feel, and so you can judge the amount of yarn you're going to use. Okay, so if you're using the same yarn as I did and your swatch measures the same as mine does, then you should use roughly the same amount of yarn that I did. Okay, so this little swatch, I've deliberately kept it as small as possible to hopefully encourage more of you to actually make it. So you can see it's very small, so it won't take you very long to do at all. So what I've done, I'll put that to one side. So I've got my scissors, because with overlay mosaic crochet you are doing one row for every colour. So you just use one colour for one row and you cut the yarn at the end of every row. Don't worry about all of the ends though, we don't need to weave them in, because I usually will recommend that you do an envelope border, and indeed I will do another video for that border. Okay, so I am starting with actually a 3.75mm hook. Now my pattern says a 4mm, which is the average size that most people will probably use with the Stylecraft special double knit. I just use a slightly smaller hook because I've noticed over time that my stitching seems to have got slightly looser. But so you'll probably, if you've done any crocheting with the same yarn before, then you'll have an idea which hook that you normally use, and I would recommend you start with that one. Okay, so Adventures in Overlay Mosaic is written for just literally a main colour. So this is the background colour. So I've used this hint of lilac for that. And then a contrast. Now the idea is that you can actually use it as a stash buster. So for each pattern you can use a completely different contrast if you want. Or I have actually just created a couple of official colour packs which use either 6 or 8 shades if you want to use one of them. It's entirely up to you. Okay, so to get started we are going to start with our contrast colour. Okay, so chart 1, pattern 1 starts with that. So when I get started, I mean, you can either put a slip knot on your hook, or what I tend to do, to be honest, is just, if you see that, just twist that yarn around, pull a chain through, and then I don't pull that tight. If I was to pull that tight, it would effectively become a slip knot. I'm going to leave that loose as a kind of bonus chain. Okay, so when you're doing such a tiny little swatch, then you're very unlikely to miscount, but the wider a project gets, the more likely you are that you may have miscounted, and there's always a chance you might just need that extra chain. And indeed you could put an extra couple of chains in if you like, especially if you're doing a border, because any excess chains will always be hidden in the border anyway. Okay, but so for the purpose of the gauge swatch we now need to do 14 chains. Okay, so that 14 is, let's say the repeat is 4 stitches, so you and we've got 2 repeats, so that makes 8. I then add an extra stitch, which is like a balancing stitch, just so that the design sits nicely in the middle and it perfectly mirrored on the left and the right. And so that's the one extra there, and then the other 4 stitches that I'll add on would be 4 at each end. You have an edge stitch and a chain. Okay, so that is, if you had 8 plus 1 plus 4, that's 13. The 14th one is going to be a turning chain, and I actually have no idea how many chains I've got here, so let me just, because I've been talking, let me just count that up. So ignoring the first one, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Fabulous. Okay, so I now have my 14 chains, and what we're going to do, we're not actually going to be working into the front of the chains here, as you probably normally would, because we're going to need both of these loops when we come to create our border. So what we're going to do, we're going to just turn that around, and if you can see on the back there, you've got these sort of horizontal lines, a sort of a back bump. Okay, so that's what we're going to be working into for our first row. So we ignore this very first one because that's our turning chain, and we're going to start with a double crochet under there. Okay, then we have a chain. Now make sure this chain at this end and at the other end of the row when you come to it, make sure they aren't too tight, because when we do our border, we're going to be working into those. Okay, so we now skip the chain underneath, and we're going to now do a little run of 9 double crochets. Now what that represents is 2 repeats of 4 stitch repeat plus a balancing stitch so that the pattern stays nicely centered. Okay, so that's 9 there for the gauge swatch. Obviously, if you are making something a lot wider, you'll have a lot more stitches, but that'll always be a multiple of 4 stitches plus 1 between those chains. Okay, and actually if you do want to combine this pattern with lots of my other mosaic designs, make sure you have a multiple of 48 stitches plus 1 between, because basically just about all of my mosaic patterns will fit into 48 stitch repeat. Okay, so I've totally lost count there. What have I got? 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we have our chain at the end, which is again going to be used for the border. Skip that chain and work our final stitch there. So as you can see, I haven't actually used this sort of bonus chain at the beginning. I'm not going to pull it tight now. I mean, it's pretty obvious when we're doing something so tiny that we've got the right number of stitches, but if you are doing something bigger, it's always worth just leaving it like that until you've done the actual pattern, and then you'll be able to just, if you need to use it, you can always like add that extra stitch. Okay, so to fasten off, just pull that chain through there. You'll want to, certainly when you come to make the actual blanket, you'll want to leave, I would say, at least sort of 4 inches there, 10 centimeters, because we will be knotting the ends together, and that'll just sort of give you something to play with. Okay, so that is now row 1 of the gauge swatch done. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you have got your little foundation row 1 the right way up. And the way you know how to know that that's right is if you see these top loops, they're all tilted slightly towards you, so you can see them. If I actually now turn it over, you can see it looks completely different. There's no, the loops aren't tilted towards you at all, and the sort of shape of the stitches are different. And if you manage to get it that way around again, they're not tilted towards you. Okay, so if you look at it like so, you'll see you're on the right side. Okay, so we're now going to pick up our main colour, and this time we are going to start with a slip knot, or my sort of version of it is to start just as we did on the chain, the twist there, and pull a chain through, but then I just pull that tight, and that effectively becomes a slip knot. Okay, so picking up our row 1, we're going to start with our edge stitch. Now edge stitches are always worked under both loops. It just gives you a slightly firmer edge to work with. Okay, so that goes under both loops, and then we have a chain, which again, like we did here, you don't want to be too tight. Now the basis of overlay mosaic crochet is rows of back loop double crochets, and then we create the pattern by dropping trebles down in front of them to cover up some of them, so you're only ever using one color at a time. Okay, so for the purpose of this row, we are going to be doing, like I said, we've got our edge stitch chain, so we're going to miss this chain, and we're now going to do 9 back loop double crochet. So it's a standard double crochet, but you're only working into that back loop. There's no need to worry. I know sometimes when people are asked to work into back loops, they also like to pick up this 3rd loop on the back. I don't see any reason to do that when you're doing overlay mosaic crochet, although it seems to pull up, they soon settle down, and you're going to be working your front loop stitches in just one loop anyway, so it seems a little pointless to me, and also it slows me down if I'm trying to go through that other part of the stitch. Right, so we're now up to that chain, so that should be 9 stitches. Let's just double check that. So there is our first chain, and we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Marvelous. So we end with a chain, skip the chain underneath, and again our final edge stitch, like the first one, is under both loops. Okay, and fasten off. Okay, so that's the first 2 rows done. So for row 3 we are picking up our contrast colour again, and again we're starting with a slip knot on our hook, and again we're going to start the row with a double crochet under both loops and a chain. So on this row, as I said before, see at the moment we've only been using back loop double crochets. We're now going to start creating the pattern, so we're going to be dropping some trebles in. Okay, so for row 3, so if you look at the, if you're looking at the chart, you'll see wherever there's no symbol in, if you haven't got a symbol in the square in the chart, then that means you're just doing a double crochet. So we're starting with a back loop double crochet, that is back loop double crochet. Now this is our balancing stitch. I always put that at the beginning. Some designers put the balancing stitch at the end of the row. I put mine at the beginning. So we've got 1 back loop double crochet before we actually start our stitch repeat. Then our repeat is another back loop double crochet, and then we get an F. So where you see the capital F in a box, in a cell in the chart, then you know you've got to now do a front loop treble. So when we're doing our trebles, we're not working into the row we've just done. I'm going to drop it down to the row below that. Okay, so this is how we're creating the pattern. We're going to be covering up some of the stitches on our row in the other colour. Okay, so you'll know which one it is. You can see the next stitch would be in there, so we're going to go straight down, okay, and work our treble into there. Then we end our repeat with 2 rows. So what you want to do, every time you've done a front loop treble, make sure you miss the double crochet behind it. Okay, so we're not working into there. We're now going to finish our repeat with 2 double crochets. So you never work in to the stitch behind the treble. Okay, so that is our little repeat. So we'll now do that once more. So we have 1 back loop double crochet, then 1 front loop treble, 2 rows down, and then we end our repeat with 2 back loop double crochets. Okay, and then once you're at the end of the row, chain, skip the chain, edge stitch, so under both loops, fasten off. Okay, so that is really all there is to it, but we'll carry on, do a little bit more. Okay, so for row 4 we're now going to go back to our main colour. Slip knot, edge stitch under both loops, chain. So for this one we've still got a back loop double crochet as our balancing stitch before we start our repeat, and now our repeat is even easier. It's just 1 front loop treble and 1 back loop double crochet repeated across. Okay, so front loop treble, back loop double crochet, and again, and again, and then chain, edge stitch. Marvellous. So that's row 4. For row 5 we go back to our contrast colour, slip knot, edge stitch, chain. Now this time we're actually starting, our balancing stitch is a front loop treble. Okay, into there. Then we have 3 back loop double crochets, and 1 front loop treble, which we're now going to do again. Two, 3, and treble chain, skip the chain, and a double crochet edge stitch there. Okay, so you can see hopefully how nice and quick and easy that is to do. So, oh, and now we know that our pattern is all lined up right, so we can actually remember to tighten up our initial chain there. So that's what the front looks like. So I'll carry on. We'll carry on and do the rest in a moment. I'm just going to show you the back. So the back of Overlay Mosaic is stripy. Okay. So if you've got large runs of front loop trebles on the front, you will get some like little pockets on the back. But that's perfectly normal. But say because we're actually haven't got these long runs, then it's just nice stripes. Okay, so for row 6, I have now got started with our edge stitch and that initial chain, and we've now got 2 back loop double crochet. So the first one is our balancing stitch, and then our repeat starts with another back loop double crochet. Then we have front loop treble there, which should be centered nicely, like so. Then 3 back loop double crochets. One thing as well I should probably mention is sometimes you might find you're getting, if I pull that out, you can see like these loops where you've worked your trebles into. If you find that you are getting quite large loops there's 2 things you can do. One is to make sure that you keep this first part of your stitch not too big. So that'll keep your top loops nice and evenly tensioned and not too large. So just pull that first bit of your stitch down a little bit. Don't yank it so it's so tight that you can't get a hook in, but just tension that a little bit. And then when you do the rest of your stitch, don't pull this bit too tight. Okay, so just give it a little freedom. Okay, and that should stop you getting big loops. If you do get some little loops showing, they generally settle down after a while anyway. Okay, so that's just another little tip there. And then end as usual. Okay, so we've now got to sort of, although we're more than halfway through the number of rows, we've actually got to the halfway point of how the pattern works, because we're now going to effectively be doing, because it's symmetrical rows wise, we're now actually going to be repeating the rows we've done previously. So what we did on row 5 is exactly the same as we're now going to do on row 7. It's all listed out in the pattern, you don't actually need to worry about that. But that is basically, I'm now going to show you what you've already seen. So, edge stitch chain, front loop treble, and then I'll repeat is 3 back loop double crochets and 1 front loop treble. It there. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and 1. Alright, so that was the same as row 5. So row 8 will be the same as row 4, and row 9 will be the same as row 3. Okay, so I am now just going to finish off like that. And then I'll come back. I'll just show you how it is when it's finished, and we'll also then run through some other bits and pieces like how you measure your gauge swatch, and also I'll show you how to extend it if you wanted to repeat the pattern rows wise. Okay, so here is my completed little gauge swatch. So now what we need to do is check that check the size of this so we can compare it to what it says in the pattern. So to do that, I have now got a ruler here. So we are not worrying about how many stitches there are to 10 centimeters or anything like that. And in fact, obviously this is a lot smaller than 10 centimeters. To make things simple for you, we're literally going to measure the size of this little swatch. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to drop my ruler on there. And you can hopefully see it's 7 centimeters wide. And if I then rotate it around like so, 6 centimeters tall. Okay, so that is the gauge that we work to in the pattern. If your swatch is a little bit bigger than this, I mean, you may even be using totally different yarn, like an Aran weight or something, then it will be. The main thing to make sure is that you are happy with the way the fabric looks, so there's not too many gaps or stitches showing through, and also you like the way it feels, so it's not too stiff either. Okay, so if you're happy with that, just bear in mind if yours is bigger and you are using the same yarn as me, you may need a little bit more yarn. Okay, you may not quite have enough in the yarn packs if you're using them. Obviously, if you're using a totally different weight, you will need to use the hook size that goes with the weight of yarn you're using, and your size will be bigger. And you'll have to judge really for yourself how much extra yarn to buy for that. Obviously, if your swatch turns out smaller, again, check that you are happy with the way it looks and feels. So if you don't think, if it is a lot smaller and using the same yarn, you might think it's really stiff. So if so, you might want to consider using a larger hook. So we've done the gauge swatch, but one more thing I want to say to you is in this pattern, in the Adventures in Overlay Mosaic pattern, there are actually 23 separate little charts, sort of averaging sort of this sort of size really. So they're all small bite-sized little simple patterns that you can mix and match. You can also, if you want, extend them, so you don't just have to do the repeat ones. What we can do is actually do that again. So what we can do, if you look at the chart for the gauge swatch, or indeed for part 1, you'll see on my chart, sorry, it's just scrolling around on my pattern there, you'll see on my chart that there's a solid black box. The stitches within that solid box you can repeat, so you can repeat them widthwise as many times as you want, and you can repeat them the rows as well. So maybe what we ought to do now is just run through another little repeat of this, just so you can see what I mean. So we've got our first repeat, and if we now go back, now if you'll notice when you're looking at the chart, all the written instructions, if you want to repeat the rows, you don't repeat row 1. So row 1 isn't within the solid black box, it's just to kind of get us started. Okay, so we are going to start straight away with row 2 using our main color. So, and row 2 was a nice easy one, remember, that was just a plain row of double crochets. So I will now go and do that, back loop double crochets of course. Okay, so I've now started row 3 with my edge stitch and chain, the way we start every single row. And remember that now begins with 1 back loop double crochet before we start our repeat. Then our repeat is another back loop double crochet, 1 front loop treble, and we end with 2 back loop double crochets. Okay, so now just repeat that again. Ooh. 1, 1, 2 back loop double crochets, chain, and edge stitch. Okay, so I will just now go and complete this second repeat and just show you what that looks like at the end, just so you get an idea. And you can do the same with every single one of the 23 patterns in this pattern. If you want a longer bit, you can do that, or you can indeed create an entire blanket just out of one of the motifs repeated. And in fact, I have made a couple of samples like that, so I will just put a little sort of snap of those at the end of the video too. Okay, so as promised, this is what it looks like if you then repeat that chart. So that's another pleasing little pattern. So like I say, there's so many different ways you can use this pattern. I hope you'll enjoy playing with them as much as I have.